Ladybugs and Yellow Jackets, welcome to Friday's Author Reads here on Fae Productions. I am your host, Fairy Princess Lolly, which I'm sure you all know because you are awesome and you have tuned in here many times before and you are all loyal subscribers. But if you aren't, then I really highly suggest click the like and subscribe button, pow pow, ring the bell if you would like to get notifications. And I am here today with a super awesome author, AJ Page. Yes, hello, AJ. Say hello to your adoring fans. Yes, the crowd goes wild. So it was kind of interesting how we crossed paths, actually, because it was really, I think, through LARPing circles and extended friends that we came into contact with one another. So what is your, I'm curious though, because I don't think that I've ever actually crossed your path directly. It was only by both of us having mutual friends that recommended things, and now here you are. I'm curious though, what is your actual involvement in the LARPy thing?
The LARPy thing? Well, we in Canada have Canada at Midnight, which is the Vampire the Masquerade, and I believe Requiem is still running out here. We run all of those. My husband and I were involved for about 10 years, though we've sort of pulled back lately, just time and now, quarantine.
Yeah. Right. So does that play in it all? So first I should allow you to introduce yourself and talk about your book a little bit, but the question I was going to ask was, does the LARPy thing play into your book? So you go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm AJ Page. I'm one half of the authors of A Cold Day in Hell. My husband and I co-wrote it together, which is where the pen name AJ Page comes from. My name's Alex, and he's not here with us today, but his name's Jay, and that's where we got our pseudonym from.
I like that.
Yeah. So yeah, we've both been involved with Vampire the Masquerade and World of Darkness and things like that for years and years and years. So while I wouldn't say LARP specifically played a role in this book, the World of Darkness as a whole was definitely a big factor.
Inspiration.
Yeah, it was a huge, huge inspiration. I mean, along with all the other famous supernatural and horror and vampire culture out there. But Vampire the Masquerade is actually how he and I first met. So it's definitely been a big part of our relationship and the book and everything.
And so how is it that, tell me a little bit about your book. Like what genre would you describe it as? And does it involve elements that people familiar with those games and that LARP or whatever would recognize?
Definitely a little. I mean, it does include a lot of the supernatural genres. Let's say there's vampires, there's ghosts, there's demons, there's werewolves as the series goes on and on. But the initial book is just pretty vampire and hunter based, and hunters are really the main focus of the book. The main character herself is a hunter, and she joins up with other hunters. So that's really more.
It is called the Huntress Saga, right?
It is the Huntress Saga. It is an 8-book series that we're working on. First endeavor. The first book has been published. The second book is well underway, and I've drafted out to the point of completion the first 6 books. They just now need to be fixed and made better.
So that is a thing that we will come back to, I think, here in a minute. What I'm curious. So you are from Canada, then?
Yes.
No wonder you're so nice. So I heard through the grapevine that you have another claim to fame, though, in the World of Darkness. Is that true?
Yes, it is. I was one of the models for the Sedite Giovanni Alliance in the new. Well, I guess it's not new anymore, but it was when I modeled for it, the By Night Studios LARP book. So yes, some people might recognize me from that.
Famous model. It's amazing. So what have you chosen? So I should just say first to folks in the audience, if you're watching from home, her information is in the low bar and links, etc., to her store where you can get her book as she is reading, if you decide. Also, you can at any time you can hit that super chat if you would like to leave her tips in order to support supporting the small press and indie authors from home is very important at this time, guys. So it's super appreciated. And I will go ahead and let you tell us a little bit about what you're going to read today, and then hand the full screen over to you.
All right. So the thing I'm gonna read today is the third chapter in the book. So the first chapter is just really getting to know Mona, who she is, and then the second chapter first introduces the supernatural. And so that's kind of where we're picking up from, is her finding her way.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you then, and we shall allow you.
All right. Mona opened her eyes, looking around the darkened bedroom. She knew what the sound was, but hoped that it had only been a dream. Under the blanket, she crossed her fingers. For long minutes, there was nothing, just the feeling of the heavy silence as she strained to catch even the barest gust of wind from 2 floors below. Slowly, she let her muscles relax, and her eyes began to drift closed, satisfied that nothing was wrong. It must have been a dream. Light filled the room, and Mona bolted upright as static pierced the air. The old television on her dresser had flared to life, though she had not turned it on in longer than she could recall. Mona wasn't even certain it still worked, but now it squealed and snow flickered on the screen. She inched forward off the bed, reaching towards the switch. There must have been a power surge that caused the set to turn on, she decided, pointedly ignoring the fact that none of the lights or other electrical devices had so much as flickered. Even her alarm clock was still showing the time clearly. As her fingers made contact with the switch, she heard the change in that static distinctly. Mona. Her name had been whispered under the static. She froze, hand still extended, waiting. She might have still been half asleep. She might have imagined it. But somehow she knew that she hadn't. She'd heard her name clearly, and something in it had been so very familiar. She bit her lip before making a decision. Hello? She wasn't sure whether to direct the greeting at the TV or not. It felt silly, but somehow like the right thing to do. As the set abruptly switched off, she jumped back, losing her balance and tumbling to the floor. Heart pounding, she listened. She'd read books about ghostly encounters and other supernatural things before, but had always disregarded them. She'd never understood how anyone could be foolish enough to believe campfire stories. Now, sitting in the middle of her bedroom floor in her nightclothes, desperately straining to hear anything, she knew that she should feel foolish or maybe terrified. Instead, she was really only curious. She'd never been one for ghost stories. She wasn't titillated by horror and didn't enjoy things that made her tense. But now she understood the thrill of it. The suspense of the moment made her skin tingle, and as ridiculous as she knew it was, she didn't want it to stop. She squeaked as another noise rang through the house. Clamping a hand over her mouth, she squeezed her eyes shut. She could hear that unmistakable whirling noise, the high-pitched whine of an electrical tool. It could only be coming from the basement where all of her father's tools sat untouched. The idea of venturing into the basement again, in the middle of the night, was the last thing she could imagine wanting to do. Yet Mona still found herself slipping on a pair of her running shoes and making her way into the hallway and downstairs. Once she reached the main floor, the noise was louder, and she could identify it. A saw was running. She opened the door to the basement stairs and was overcome with conflicting emotions. She was relieved that the light was on, as that meant she wouldn't have to venture down there in the dark. But she fought down a surge of panic when she knew she had not turned on any lights down there in a year. Once more, the thought of ignoring the whole thing and crawling back into bed occurred to her, but she was already moving down the stairs as if some unknown force were pulling her onward. The basement light wasn't swinging as she stepped onto the cement floor, and the shadows were stationary. The saw was still buzzing as she moved forward, and she could make out the form of a man between the posts separating the tool room. He stood with his back to her, slightly hunched over. Whatever courage she'd had before, whatever invisible force had driven her on, now abandoned her, and her mouth went dry as she tried to call out. This was a dangerous and stupid plan. There was an intruder in her house, and she should have called the police, not traipsed downstairs, unarmed, with no plan. He hadn't seen her yet. There was still time to sneak back upstairs and call the police. She'd taken one step back when the man's head lifted and he turned to look at her. Daddy? The word escaped her mouth without thinking. It was her father. She knew his profile illuminated against the far wall. She even remembered the shirt he was wearing. It was hung up in a closet somewhere in the house. He smiled at her as the saw finally shut off. Hi, Pumpkin. His voice brought back 1,000 memories flooding to her. Birthdays, car rides, family dinners. How very much Mona missed her father welled up inside her suddenly, and she wanted to throw herself into his arms. It was like he'd been just downstairs the whole time. Something about him kept her in place, though. There was something wrong with him. It was as if he were flickering in and out of focus too quickly for her to pinpoint, but there was something not right. Hi, Daddy, she managed at last. Where's your mom? We've got to get this window fixed after last night. The window behind him had been fine until he spoke, but now sparkling pieces of glass covered the floor, and snow drifted in to join the foot-high pile on the ground. What happened? Why is the window broken? She asked. Why is the window... His brows furrowed. His image flickered more distinctly, the color fading from him. Loud whirling filled the room again as the saw blade buzzed to life, and he disappeared momentarily. Mona took a step forward, willing him to come back, not certain what had happened. The thought that he was gone forever, for the second time in her life, was unbearable. Daddy, she called after him, desperation in her voice. She'd loved her mother. She'd been the pillar of strength in their family. But at her very heart, Mona had always been a daddy's girl. He'd been the one that understood she didn't want to act like the other kids, that she didn't want to date or make friends. He'd always gone to bat for her, whether it had been against the school, unwanted attention from her peers, or even her mother. Hi, Pumpkin, he said, stepping around the corner again, his smile identical to last time. Where's your mom? We've got to get this window fixed after last night. Mona took an involuntary step back. When she didn't answer, he tilted his head to one side. She's not coming this time, is he? He looked around the basement. As she watched, his color faded until he resembled a black and white figure out of a color screen. A look of concentration passed over him, and his form solidified again, though his color still wasn't right. Mom isn't... Mona shook her head. No. The figure sighed, his eyes sad as he looked at her. His voice was plaintive, and his eyebrows were drawn together in pain. We were just trying to protect you. You know that, right? We just wanted to keep you and your brother safe. I know, Daddy, you did. She didn't know what he meant, but the last thing she was going to do was disagree. Not this time. The figure turned abruptly to face the broken window. He walked forward, the flickering getting worse with each step. He was gone now more than not, and even his voice flickered and guttered. This time you have to run, Mona. From what, Daddy? Where should I go? If he kept talking, she didn't know, as her father flickered one last time and didn't reappear. She saw only boot prints in the snow before the light above her flashed and burned out, plunging the basement into darkness. Mona stumbled backwards 2 steps in shock before fear raced up her spine and she broke into a run. The steps to the main floor seemed determined to trip her, and she fell twice, crying out in equal parts pain and fear. If she'd been in any position to think, she'd have been certain of the bruises that would blossom there. Reaching the main floor did only a little for her sanity as she yanked her coat on and scrambled for her car keys. The garage was chilly, and for a moment she considered returning to her room to dress, but the presence of her father must have known her thoughts as the sound of a whirling saw filled the empty garage. She cried out and yanked open the truck door, falling into the seat as much as sitting there. The garage door groaned in complaint as she hammered the automatic open button. Ice cracked outside as the night air flooded in. Mona slammed her foot onto the gas and nearly spun out as she took the first turn out of her driveway. Only the reflexes of learning to drive on snow-covered roads saved her as she spun the wheel to compensate, finally regaining control. Her headlights illuminated little beyond the iced-over car still sitting on the street outside her house. Mona took in the fact without really acknowledging it. Once on the road, the shivering set in again, and she reached down to turn on the heat, despite knowing that it would do no good until the truck was warmed up. She paused as her fingers touched a slick piece of card that she knew had not been there before. Slowing the truck, she flicked on the interior light to read it. It was weathered but readable. It was a business card for Parker's, a local bar and diner, one of the few open 24 hours even in the wintertime. She flipped it over to find her name scrawled there in a fine black pen. This card had been meant for her. Normally, Mona would have questioned this. She would have been frightened that someone had been in her truck, disgusted that they must have come into her house. Tonight was not the night for those kinds of feelings. Instead, the card gave her a destination. It gave her the possibility that there would be an answer to be had, and that was the one thing that could grant her calm. With her hands tight on the wheel and shock threatening her, Mona drove. Parker's was the sort of diner every town had. Vinyl seats in varying shades of blue-green and green-blue, linoleum countertops that were worn smooth, and the same waitresses and cooks who'd worked there all their lives. At Parker's, the nighttime cook and waitstaff was made up entirely of a single man, the owner himself, named Parker. He was in his 60s, graying and bearded. He'd owned the location as long as Mona could remember, at least since she'd been in high school. He was the sort of man who didn't look closely at the people who walked in, and who was as comfortable serving beer at 7 a.m. as he was serving the all-day breakfast. Mona had not spent a lot of time there, but she knew the place well enough for Parker to recognize her. He gave her a nod as she took a seat at the counter and brought a menu and a coffee. She nodded her thanks, looking around. Now that she had arrived, the ridiculousness of the night was finally starting to set in. Who or what had she expected to find here? The late-night crowd looked like it always did. A couple of teenagers sat in the booth nearest her left, deeply involved in some conversation over untouched burgers, and 2 men were seated along the same counter seat she had selected, one of whom she recognized as the father of a library patron, and another man she had never met. He was older, and had hunched down into his fur-lined hunting jacket as far as he could, with a trucker cap pulled down low over his eyes. Only one other customer sat in the restaurant, and it retroactively seemed impossible to her that she hadn't noticed him first. He was young, in his very early 20s, maybe even his late teens, attractive in a high school rebel sort of way. Bleached blonde hair slicked back, and a black leather motorcycle jacket made him stand out among the winter coats and generic appearances of everyone else there. His eyes were a pale blue and were filled with challenge when she looked at him, a challenge that was meant all for her. He made her want to leave. He made her want to fight. He made her want to tell everyone else to get out because this was, without a doubt, an extremely dangerous man. As they made eye contact, he smirked and made the barest gesture with his hand, beckoning her over. Every part of her screamed to run, but she reached into her pocket to touch the business card there. She'd never been one to walk away from curiosity. Fingers still clutching her mug, she walked to his table and sat down. He smiled at her, and she resisted the urge to flinch back. "Hello, Mona." His voice was smooth and calm, careful. It made her reevaluate his age. This was no teenager. She withdrew the card from her pocket and tapped it on the table. "Did you leave me this?" she asked. He smirked at her. "My people did that. I wanted to ensure we could talk in a neutral place." His tone set her nerves on edge, and her temper flared. "Are you responsible for what happened in my house?" she demanded, arching an eyebrow. "Me?" He looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion. "Oh, no. Your house is haunted." "My house is haunted." Somehow hearing someone say it out loud made it feel as impossible and ridiculous as she'd always felt. "Haunted, yes. You do know about that sort of thing, don't you?" he answered, watching her reaction. When she didn't respond, he raised an eyebrow. "You don't know? Do you even know what you are?" "Apparently not," she answered, not hiding the irritation in her voice. It was late, she was cold, and the adrenaline from earlier had gone, leaving her weak. She was in no mood for games. He blinked at her in surprise for a moment. "Well then, I'm not certain if that will make things more or less difficult. My name is Brennan, and I represent an organization of people who specialize in making mutually beneficial agreements with your kind." Confusion whirled through her. "Mutually beneficial? My kind? Listen, I don't know." The words froze in her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being pumped. At the very peripheral of her vision, she saw the gleam of a gun barrel beside her. She blinked once, looking at the blond man, Brennan, twitch, as if to try and dodge the inevitable. Her mind, working faster than her body, knew there was no chance. The gun was too close. There was no way for him to avoid the bullet. She managed a half prayer that the resulting shrapnel wouldn't hit her before the world exploded. The gun had fired next to her, and Brennan disintegrated into ashes. The adrenaline pumped through her body once again and made that strange fact completely unimportant. Deafened in one ear, she turned to face the man in the trucker cap as he pumped the shotgun to expel the spent round. He reached out and grabbed hold of her by the jacket. The world swam around her, and a high-pitched whine began in her left ear. He was yelling something at her, but it took a few seconds for her to make it out. He shook her, and the words finally penetrated the swirling fog that had dulled her senses. "Are you with them?" he was yelling, over and over. "Are you?" No, with who? I don't know." She was babbling, but he still had the gun out. She saw Parker behind the man yell something, and then duck as the man in the hat turned and fired into the glass behind the bar, one hand still holding her by the collar of the jacket. Her hearing flickered back in a flash as she turned her head to the door at the sound of a little bell there jingling happily. The man in the trucker cap turned as well, letting her go as he did. Her legs weren't prepared to hold her up yet, and she fell to a heap on the floor. Boston walked in, a combat shotgun casually tossed over her shoulder. He looked ready to make a dramatic entrance, but had not been expecting to wander into the scene he had. He and the man in the hat locked eyes, both waiting for the other to make a move. Mona took the moment to push herself to her unsteady feet, shove past the stranger, and sprint the short distance to the counter. Gunfire started almost as soon as she was on her feet, but adrenaline pushed her forward, heedless of what was happening between them. She leapt over the counter and collapsed, covering her head. She could see blood on the floor amidst the glass, and assumed that Parker must have been hit. She wanted to look around for him, but the chaos so close by kept her frozen in place. Slowly, the gunfire stopped, and Mona took her hands off of her head. The only sound from the other side of the diner were a set of heavy boots coming closer. All she could do was tilt her head back to look up at the counter, as the barrel of a shotgun came over the edge, followed by the brim of a trucker hat and angry eyes. There was no question in his expression this time. He didn't care who she was. He didn't care who she was with. He was going to finish her. She wanted to close her eyes, but couldn't stop herself from staring at him. He had to know that she was no danger, no threat. She was still staring at him as the butt of a shotgun smashed into his temple. His eyes glazed over as he slumped to the side, and she heard him hit the ground. Slowly, she uncurled from the tight ball, getting her knees under her as Boston's face replaced the stranger's. He gave her a little smile and held a hand down to her. "It's time to go, darling," he said. His voice was steady, and she took his hand. He was strong and vaulted her over the counter, her feet not even under her yet. Safely on the other side, he didn't wait for her to steady herself or have the chance to look around before wrapping an arm around her shoulder and hustling them both out of the diner. His truck was idling across 3 spaces in the parking lot, a swerve of tire tracks behind it. Ever the gentleman, he still stopped to open the door for her, though that may have been as much to bustle her in as to help her. Soon they were flying along the snowy roads, leaving the diner behind them as quickly as they could. "So," she started before he cut her off. "Sorry, questions can wait till we're somewhere safe." He shook his head at her. His eyes were on the rearview mirror, watching for anything that might follow them. The idea of safety seemed 1,000 miles away. She had thought her house was safe. She had thought Parker's was safe. "You have somewhere safe?" "Yeah," he gave her a grin. "My house." And that's the end of chapter 3.
All right. Well, that is a plunged right into the action, wasn't it? So we have actually quite the list of questions from the audience, right? Also a couple of super chats. So I wanted to give a shout out on those. I said thanks in the chat, but also thank you for the super chats, folks. And so I am going to actually give those who gave you the super chats, which were Donkey Kong, Conky, I don't know. Conky, yes, Branky Kong. That's it. Branky Kong and Tally, I think. I'm going to give them the preference. And then Philippe, also, he went and bought one of your books. So that's like super chat, right? So I'm giving them question preference in the order of question asking. So question number 1 was 8 books, or was it 6? Anyway, a lot of books. Yeah, 8 books. That's a lot. And are you hoping to angle at a TV series by the time you have completed all of this? Is that a thing that has maybe crossed the horizons of your far-reaching mind? And 2, how big is the scope of the story overall?
So, I mean, obviously I would love any kind of TV show, movie, anything, if you've got contacts, you know. That would be phenomenal. Definitely a TV series would be, I think, the most successful way to do it, because the cast of characters in 8 books, of course, does get quite large. And I think in a movie format would be pretty unwieldy. And then in terms of scope of the book, in terms of the world itself, the scope stays moderately small. The first 2 books take place primarily in Nebraska, but after that they move over to New Orleans, and that's pretty much where it stays for the most part. But in terms of the plot scope, I like to think it gets quite large.
New Orleans is beautiful, and Nebraska. How did you choose to start in Nebraska?
My husband did some work in Nebraska, so he described it to me a lot with the isolation factor, and that even though it's a tighter community, there's a very distant feeling between neighbors, and that to me seemed like the perfect place for ghosts and the supernatural and things like that. And then New Orleans, just because it is one of my favorite places in the whole world, and it's also where my husband and I met.
Aw, that's kind of romantic.
Yeah.
So question number 2, and New Orleans is beautiful. I agree. I've been there a couple times. If only it wasn't humid, right?
Yeah.
That is a personal thing of mine, but how have you handled being a new author in a genre that Laura K. Hamilton is a powerhouse in?
Well, I like to think that I'm, as an indie author, handling it as well as I can. I did shop the book around to quite a number of publishers before I went the self-publishing route, and the big note that I got back from them was always that this genre's overrun. We're not looking for anyone else in this kind of paranormal vampire thing. And I think that's a shame, because there's definitely a market, there's definitely an audience for it, and I like to think that this hasn't been done in exactly this way. The book, despite having romance in it and despite having vampires in it, is not Twilight, it's not Anne Rice, it's something quite different.
Yes, well, different from Twilight is good.
Well, I mean, I'm not a Twilight fan by any stretch, but I did read them because I think every book deserves a fair shot at whether or not it's going to be good. But one of the big things I wanted with this book, actually, was in the space of a couple years, I read Twilight, Hunger Games, I reread Harry Potter, I did all of those. And I found the big problem was that all of the main characters, all of the protagonists, were quite young. They were coming of age. Some of them were children, they were teenagers, or they were very young 20s. And that's great, but I'm not. I'm looking for a main character that, while still existing in this YA kind of safe world, is an adult, has lived a life, is getting older, and how they would come up against things like that. I wanted a character that I could connect with, not that I was looking back on how I used to connect with things as a teenager.
That is legitimate, I think, and actually pretty true. It does seem like in that genre, everybody is always so young, right?
Yeah.
Which then, of course, leads to its own set of weirdness. But question number 3 is, who would your dream actress be to play Mona?
That's a hard one. Nowadays, it's pretty difficult. I wish I could remember her name. There was a character in The Haunting of Hill House, the girl who always wore the gloves, who when she touched people got their memories or their emotions. I can't remember her name. Kate Siegel, I want to say.
I don't know, but it gave me goosebumps.
She's definitely someone, because she's a very strong female character in everything I've seen her in. She's very emotive and she doesn't simper. She's very face forward.
So, speaking of female characters, so there are a couple here. But one of the first questions that came was it difficult to write with your spouse? And I guess the reason I say, like, speaking of female characters is because it makes me wonder, like, who had involvement and how? Was he writing the girls or the guys, or was it all collaborative everywhere, or?
It was very collaborative, though with our roleplay experience, we did a lot of scene acting to make sure the conversations always felt like they flowed very naturally. So instead of sitting down together at a computer, I would record and we would act out the scene and see what fit and what didn't, and when natural conversations would come. Because when you're typing, it feels like you're talking to yourself and it can get kind of stilted.
That actually makes sense, and how fun too. I think that it seems like a very bonding thing to do. I'm curious, how did you guys deal, kind of building on this question a little bit, how did you guys deal with disagreements in how you thought things should go?
Thus far, we've had not a ton of problems in terms of what we're seeing, what we have the vision of. As the primary writer, I'm going to go ahead and take credit as. I'm the one who actually sits down and does the typing and turns it into a book format. I sort of get the final call if there is a disagreement. But since he is a co-creator, if there's something that he really feels is important, I have to assume that's going to go somewhere. We're not just going to disagree on whether a character's tall or short. We're going to disagree on whether someone lives or dies.
Right. So it's gonna be a big part of the plot. Somebody said, Holly says Catherine Zeta-Jones is who you're thinking of. I think.
Is it Catherine Zeta-Jones?
They say and then Marie says the character's name was Theo, but they can't remember the actress. And Holly said Catherine Zeta-Jones. So
I think it's Kate
I like her. She's Catherine Zeta-Jones is a great actress, though.
Oh yeah, she's phenomenal. I mean, hey, if Catherine Zeta-Jones is interested, no disagreements.
Right? Yeah, just somebody sent her my book.
Yeah, feel free to tag her. I'm in.
I had another question about this tag teaming business, and then I got off onto a tangent about Catherine Zeta-Jones, and I'm like, what was I gonna say about that? Oh, so do you guys, when you do things, do you then like have another or maybe a third party that also sort of reads or proofs your stuff a little bit to give you feedback as well? That way, if there is something, like, have you ever had something that you can't come to a decision on betwixt the two of you, and you had to maybe just be like, okay, read both of these and tell us what you like best, or something to that effect?
Yeah. Actually, my mom was one of the very first readers who read the absolutely terrible first draft of this with all of its spelling mistakes and all of its inaccuracies. She got the very, very first shot at it. And so she's sort of been our go-between when we're like, now this character, this plot, do you connect with it? What do you think? We don't tell her which one of us likes which thing. That way she can, no favoritism.
Yes, you can get the objective opinion. That's, well, as objective as possible, I suppose.
I mean, I'm sure she's required to like the book, being my mom, but...
Oh, no. So I have a question again, actually kind of coming back to, oh wait, there was one more. I want to ask all the audience questions first before I'm like, I have a question too. So, and I should say, if you guys have more questions, feel free to just put them in the chat and we will ask them. So the other one was, do you find yourself having to fight the World of Darkness influence, or do you embrace it?
Yes and no. I definitely don't ever want to take from the World of Darkness things that they have created that are specially theirs. While it might be an inspiration, I never want to rip anyone off, whether it's the World of Darkness, whether it's Anne Rice, whether it's Dracula. But at the same time, those are huge inspirations, not only while writing the book, but in my formative years as a reader. So they've definitely been huge inspirations, and it's definitely worthwhile to lean into it when they serve the book well, while always keeping an eye on it to make sure that it never over relies on it, that I'm never letting the World of Darkness do my mythology building for me.
That makes sense. Yeah. So speaking of the mythology / world building, now this kind of actually, your answer sort of brings it around to what I was wanting to build on, which was how big is the scope of the story. And so you have these 8 books, and previously when we first started the show, you had mentioned that they've all been drafted out, and now you are at the point where you are going to go back and start polishing them one by one. So does this mean that this has to do with your writing process? Does it mean that you have outlined all of your books and then you're going to go back and then actually write them, so each one of them has their plot and everything worked out? Or have you actually written full drafts of every single book?
I've written full drafts of the first 6. Wow. The last 2 are still nebulous. 7, we've got kind of a chapter outline, like step 1, step 2, step 3. Book 8 is a fantasy out there somewhere. Book 2 is pretty close to what I would call publication ready. It just needs its shine at this point.
And so how is it then that you go about building all of this world? Is that, do you actually go through the process of meticulously making all of the politics and everything and then writing it into a story? Do you write and let things go as they come along to you? What does that look like behind the scenes in your head?
I'm definitely on the latter side. I always say that I'm not writing a book. The book's telling me what it wants. I'm one of those people who just sits down and starts typing, and the characters do what they want. Jay and that's my husband, our outline gives me a structure for that, because if left to my own devices, I'll write chapter 1 and chapter 6 and chapter 12 and then forget about it for the rest of my life. So author, right? So with our outline together, I'm able to sit down and create the entirety of a chapter at a time. And then I do what I call stitching them together, which is where I take chapter 1 and 2 and figure out how they then are going to interlink in the overarch of the book.
Do you have an idea in mind for how you want it to end? Or is the reason that it's still mythical book number 8 very similar to the Game of Thrones series, right? The mythical last book. It's out there. We know it. Is it that plot needs to work itself out?
The plot definitely needs to work itself out. A lot of it has to do with the fact that each book informs the next book. So with book 7 only being sort of structured, book 8 can't really be created until we have a more secure idea of what exactly is going to happen in book 6. Though I do think we have a pretty solid plan for like the big finale and who's going to live in the overall and who's going to die in the overall. And I have written, was actually one of the very first things I wrote, was the final epilogue of the last book. So I do know exactly what the last 3 pages look like.
The last 3, like how it's all going to culminate into
the final where at the end it says the end. I've got. Now I just have to work backwards and make a book.
So some Branky Kong says, have you created any new vampire or supernatural tropes that we can look forward to in the series? And also there are many cheers in the crowd for you to finish this, because people are in quarantine and they want to binge read it. So you need to get on that.
I hear ya. So new vampire tropes. I don't know if I would say I've created new tropes per se. I think they have to be a lot more popular before they're technically tropes. But I've definitely given my vampires, and more so my hunters, a very different take on how things operate. A lot of the vampires have powers that I, at least personally, haven't seen in other books before. And then there's the culture of the hunters all in all, because I know that there's, of course, there's Supernatural, there's Anita Blake. I'm not the first person in the world to write about hunters, but I do think that this is, it's a much more generational based take on the hunters. There are hunters who exist, and then there are hunter families. And a lot of it has to do with how these hunter families came to be and why they're different from the others. So I would say that's more where I've created my own tropes.
And if I may, why did you choose to write from the angle of hunters as opposed to the angle of vampires? Or in later books, is there some switching of that where we're starting? Well, this was the 3rd chapter. So, does that go back and forth in your books, or
not really? All of the books are from Mona's perspective specifically. Except for the epilogues. Each book has an epilogue, and each epilogue has been from the point of view of either a vampire or a demon who's involved. So in that way, we get one little slice of what Mona doesn't see in the world, which gives us just a little bit more knowledge when we go into the next book as to why things are happening.
Well, it also has the power. I mean, that's a very powerful thing to put at the end of books, because that gives to the reader a potentially very different perspective on actions that the main character is taking, that they believe are moral actions, but then when more information is brought into play, as with regards to motivations and causes and effects of stuff that's going on, what might have seemed moral might now be like, oh, that was actually not quite as good as we had hoped, right? Or vice versa, right? Something that she did that maybe seems absolutely terrible, is you come to find out that wasn't really at all.
Yeah.
So that's a cool little bonus. I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I also use them as a way to kind of, not spoiler, but spoiler adjacent the next books. The epilogues at the end tend to, something Mona will find out later in that book is sort of shown a little at the end of the previous book, just to kind of keep us moving forward, which I think is the hardest thing books have. Exactly. When you read that epilogue, you should be like, oh man, when's the next book out?
Right? So what is the timeline on book number 2? It just needs its polishes and its shinies. And then are you going the self-publishing route on that again as well? Are you going to do that for the whole series?
I will probably do that for the whole series, because I just don't love the idea of self-publishing book 1 and then trying to get book 2 published. I can't imagine any publisher out there being as interested in picking up a series partway through as they would have been from being with me from the get-go.
Right.
Which isn't to say that if a publisher is interested, that I wouldn't be interested in dealing with them going forward, but I won't be seeking them out this time. I will, for all intents and purposes, be self-publishing probably through Amazon going forward, but I am looking at some other indie possibilities.
And okay, I was just checking to make sure we don't have any questions that I'm overlooking. How do you normally promote yourself as an indie author when not in quarantine? And in quarantine, have you adjusted to that to do things to promote yourself?
I have done some things to promote myself. Obviously, I have my Facebook and I have my website, but a lot of the promotion has been through word of mouth. I know that my mom, when she read it, passed it around, not the first draft, but she passed the final draft around to her entire office. And suddenly everyone there was really interested in it. And I know it's kind of moved out from there as well. Lots of people recommending it to each other. I also participated in a fan fiction competition. And so I had some copies of my book and some of my cards when I went to that. Because while it wasn't a snippet of my book, it was still a snippet of my writing and gave an idea of how I write and who I am. In terms of self-promotion in quarantine, nothing in particular. I mean, it's not like you can go out. It's not like you can hang posters or hand out cards. All you can do is try to keep up with the community on Facebook.
And that's just weird. So, yeah, it's quarantine. Why do you do this? So what was it that you decided? Now, actually, before I get on to this too quick, I wanted to ask you, because I don't think I did before, do you have a Patreon yourself?
I do not have a Patreon as AJ Page, no.
Okay.
It's just the books.
Okay, so because I know that we do have a special bonus for our Patreon patrons. I just like to call them the patronage because it's so much easier. Right, and it makes them sound all like regal and noble and aloft.
Yeah, patrons of the arts.
Patronage, that's right. That's exactly right. So I know that we do have a bonus for them, and I will let you tell everybody what you are putting up for that.
All right, so I have, honestly, I could do either or both. I can sort of let the patrons decide. I do have my copy of my very first draft of this book with all of my handwritten notes in red pen on it. And when I say my very first draft, I mean misspellings and he's being called she's and sentences that run on and on and on and on and on. All the fun things that first show up. Which I'm happy to scan and send around so that people can see how much changes and how much self-editing goes into it before it ever sees anyone's eyes. And then the other thing I have is my, I call them character cards. So it's basically a Word document that I created that has photos of all of the different celebrities that I was picturing when I wrote these characters and who they look like. For example, like the girl who I would dreamcast as Mona. There's a character in the book later on named Brett, who in my head is played by Jason Statham, things like that.
So that actually, both of those sound really super cool. I guess especially because, at least for me, I think the stuff with all of the edits, I think that sometimes when people are aspiring writers themselves, they feel like they have to write it perfect the first time, or they get stuck in that loop.
I think I've lost you.
Still? Oh, that was weird. We totally blanked out. At least we did on my end. So.
Yeah, I was frozen over here. Sorry, please try again.
We do have a comment from the crowd saying character cards sound cool. Which I think that both of them sound cool for different reasons. One is because I think that people do kind of get stuck sometimes if they're aspiring writers. They write that chapter and then they, instead of finishing, they continually edit and edit and edit and edit, feeling that it's got to be perfect the first time, right? As opposed to just getting it out there and then going back and doing it, and then they'll just get stuck at a point. And so I think that maybe just sometimes seeing seeing somebody's corrective process is like a little bit of insight into how your mind was working through things, right? When it came to the editing part. And I think that could be helpful. And I like the character card idea because it sort of has the feel of you have your manila envelope and you open it up and you read the character's like profile, you know, their age, weight, height, you know, hair color, right? And where did they go to school? Right?
Yep.
But I mean, what a good way though. What a good way to sort of keep them all organized so that when you add details to the characters as the stories go on, you know, their personnel folders, you can have it all in a nice, neat, organized way, right? And it's just not just details floating around out there and forgetting about what you did back in book 3 now that you're in book 6, and you know. So
yeah, there's many a time while writing something in book 5 or 6, I've had to go back and open 2 or 3 and be like, wait, what did they say about that?
Yeah. Do you ever, I'm curious, do you ever plan to do something, and we're actually rolling up on our time here, but do you ever plan to do, or do you just sometimes do little side, what's the word that I'm thinking of it? It's like in fanfic where you kind of get the side thread of something where somebody will write a whole story off of one little thing that never really got explored or wasn't meant to be explored by the author. It's just, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
like Rogue One. What was Rogue One? What do you call that?
All of the characters to me are living people who have backstories. There are reasons that they are the way that they are. In book 1, we meet a big group of hunters that Mona hangs out with, and as you'll probably be able to tell when the books go on, they are my favorite people in the whole cast. So I am intimately familiar with where I decided they went to elementary school and how many siblings they have and where they lived and who their friends were. Like they're people I know.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show this afternoon. It's 1:55, so I want to remind everybody all of your information is in the low bar on Facebook and also on the YouTubes. And I'm not entirely sure how that. I've only just started doing the Twitch thing, which we're on Twitch right now. I just don't really know how. I just don't really know how Twitch does a low bar. So I'm still learning that platform a little bit, but should all be down there. If you want to go pick up her book, it is free on Amazon for the Kindle version. And then you can also get the paperback version as well, which is always my preference because, well, I'm a bibliophile. So, yes. And so please go do that. Pick up a book in whatever format you find best suited. Thank you for everybody who put the super chats. You guys are awesome, and AJ will receive those. AJ, do you have anything you would like to say to your awesome fans out there before we go?
I just want to say thanks to everyone who tuned in, who had questions or super comments. I hope whether you pick the book up in paperback or in EPUB that you really enjoy it and that you find someone in it who speaks to you.
So if you are on our Patreon, then you can look forward to a bonus here coming up after the show. Get your little extra Benny there, and we will say bid adieu to you. And everybody have a good Friday and an awesome weekend. Yes, and thank you again, AJ. So, and Lee says thank you for creating this world and the characters.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
And I pushed the big red button, but I have to push it twice.